Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Coyotes County, Arizona. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The wind carries many secrets across the deserts of southeastern Arizona. In the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains, where the horizon stretches endlessly and the coyotes' calls echo through canyons at dusk, there lived a family whose name would eventually be spoken only in hushed tones. The Blackwood sisters, as they came to be known in local folklore, left behind a legacy that most official records have conveniently omitted. What happened between the years of 1887 and 1904 remains one of the most disturbing yet least documented cases of frontier justice in American history. Our story begins with a seemingly innocuous discovery made in April of 1962, when a geology student from the University of Arizona named Thomas Reeves was conducting field research in an isolated area near the ghost town of Pierce. Reeves documented in his field journal that while taking soil samples from what appeared to be an abandoned well site, he discovered a small metal box containing what he described as personal effects of considerable age and peculiar nature. Among these items was a leather-bound journal with the name Eleanor Blackwood stamped in faded gold lettering. The journal's existence was briefly noted in Reeves's thesis, but the actual contents were never published. According to university records, the items were transferred to the Arizona Historical Society's archives in Tucson. However, when researchers attempted to locate them in 1968, the collection had mysteriously disappeared from the catalog. What we know of the Blackwood sisters comes primarily from fragments of county records, newspaper clippings from the Tombstone epitaph, and oral histories collected by folklorist Margaret Wilson in the 1950s. These accounts tell of three sisters: Eleanor the eldest, born in 1865, Victoria, born in 1867, and Catherine the youngest, born in 1869. Their father, Jonathan Blackwood, was a cattle rancher who acquired a modest spread approximately 15 miles east of Tombstone following the Civil War. Their mother, Mary, reportedly died during a fever outbreak in 1877, leaving Jonathan to raise his daughters alone in the harsh conditions of the Arizona Territory. The Blackwood Ranch sat in a precarious location, nestled in a valley frequented by both Apache raiding parties and bands of outlaws who used the remote canyons as hideouts. According to tax assessments from 1885, the property consisted of approximately 640 acres with a small herd of longhorn cattle. The ranch house itself was described in a rare eyewitness account as sturdy but unrefined, built of stone and timber with a commanding view of the approach road. This strategic positioning would later prove significant. What set the Blackwood sisters apart from other frontier women was their unusual upbringing. County school records show no enrollment for any of the sisters. Instead, according to statements from neighboring rancher William Hawkins recorded in 1902, Old Man Blackwood raised those girls like sons. They could ride, shoot, and handle cattle better than most men. Never saw them in dresses, always in men's clothing. They kept to themselves mostly, polite when encountered, but distant. The transformation of the Blackwood sisters from reclusive ranchers to figures of terror appears to have begun with a tragedy. In October of 1887, Jonathan Blackwood's death was recorded in county death records. The cause was listed as misadventure, a common designation for accidental deaths. However, a brief mention in the Tombstone epitaph dated October 17, 1887, suggests something more sinister. Rancher J. Blackwood found dead near his property, sheriff's office investigating possible foul play. No follow-up articles were ever published, and no arrests were made. Following their father's death, the three sisters, aged 22, 20, and 18 at the time, continued to operate the ranch independently, a highly unusual arrangement for the era. Most unmarried women in such circumstances would have been expected to sell the property or seek male relatives for assistance and protection. Instead, the Blackwood sisters not only maintained the ranch, but expanded it. Land records indicate they gradually acquired adjacent properties between 1888 and 1895, eventually controlling over 3,000 acres. The sisters became increasingly isolated from the surrounding community. They were rarely seen in town, making only occasional trips for supplies. When they did appear, they traveled together, armed, and spoke little. A store ledger from Pierce dating to 1890 notes purchases made by E. Blackwood, including unusual quantities of ammunition, coffee, salt, and medical supplies, but little else. The sisters appeared to be almost entirely self-sufficient. The first indications of something truly unusual occurring at the Blackwood Ranch emerged in 1891. A report filed by Deputy Sheriff Thomas Miller documented a complaint from a cattle buyer named James Harmon, who claimed to have been threatened at gunpoint when he approached the Blackwood property. According to the report, Harmon stated, "The women surrounded my wagon, rifles drawn. The tall one informed me that they had no business with strangers and suggested I leave their land immediately if I valued my health. No charges were filed and the incident was dismissed as frontier hostility." Over the next several years, similar reports accumulated. Travelers reported being turned away from the property, sometimes at gunpoint. Local ranchers complained of the Blackwood sisters' aggressive expansion and their refusal to participate in community cattle drives or roundups. They operated entirely independently, selling their cattle through intermediaries rather than at local markets. What truly distinguished the Blackwood Ranch, however, was its curious resistance to the cattle rustling that plagued other properties in the region. The 1890s saw a significant increase in cattle theft throughout the Arizona Territory. The remote location of the Blackwood Ranch should have made it particularly vulnerable. Yet, according to county records, not a single official complaint of theft was ever filed by the sisters. This apparent immunity did not go unnoticed. In an 1896 letter discovered in the personal correspondence of Marshal William Breckinridge, he observed, "The peculiar circumstance of the Blackwood property remaining untouched while neighboring ranches suffer considerable losses suggests either remarkable fortune or some manner of arrangement with the criminal elements. The sisters' reputation for marksmanship may provide an alternative explanation." The first documented disappearance connected to the Blackwood Ranch occurred in January of 1893. Two cowboys employed by neighboring rancher Samuel Peterson reportedly set out to recover stray cattle believed to have wandered onto Blackwood land. According to Peterson's statement to the sheriff's office, the men, identified as Luke Donovan and Michael Riley, never returned. A search party followed their trail to the edge of Blackwood property, but did not proceed further, citing concerns about trespassing. The official report concluded the men had likely continued traveling, possibly to mining opportunities in Mexico. However, an entry in a personal diary belonging to local physician Dr. James Holbrook, dated February 3, 1893, casts doubt on this explanation. "Peterson brought me troubling news today regarding his missing men. Claims to have heard from a Mexican vaquero that shots were heard from the Blackwood place the night the men disappeared. Asked if I would accompany the sheriff to investigate. Declined. Those women unsettle me profoundly. Something in their eyes speaks of capacity for terrible things." No official investigation was conducted. In the frontier justice system of the time, the disappearance of two drifting cowboys was hardly a priority, especially without concrete evidence of wrongdoing. What followed, however, was a pattern that would repeat with disturbing regularity over the next decade. Between 1893 and 1904, local records contain references to at least 7 individuals who were last seen in the vicinity of the Blackwood Ranch. These included cattle rustlers, land speculators, and in one case, a tax assessor, whose visit to the property in 1899 was his final recorded appointment. In each instance, official investigations were cursory at best. The remote location, the lack of witnesses, and the general attitude toward frontier disappearances all contributed to a remarkable lack of scrutiny. The sisters' method of operation gradually took shape through scattered accounts. They were known to ride their property boundaries at all hours, but most frequently at night. Their black horses became a source of local superstition, with travelers claiming to have glimpsed 3 silent riders moving like shadows along the ridgelines. They never hired help, never accepted visitors, and conducted all business through a lawyer in Tombstone named Philip Green. Green's records, partially preserved in the county archives, provide rare glimpses into the sisters' activities. Receipts show regular payments to freight companies for deliveries left at designated drop points near their property boundaries. There are records of cattle sales, land purchases, and even investments in mining ventures. The sisters were not merely surviving. They were prospering in a manner almost unheard of for women in that era, especially those operating without male assistance. The most disturbing aspects of the Blackwood legend concern what allegedly happened to those who trespassed on their land with ill intent. According to oral histories collected from elderly residents of Coyotes County in the 1950s, local wisdom held that the coyotes around the Blackwood Ranch grew unusually fat and bold. One account attributed to an anonymous source described as a former ranch hand from a neighboring property stated, "Folks knew not to go looking for anyone who disappeared near that place. The Blackwood women had a way of making problems vanish. Word was they'd leave what remained for the coyotes after dark. Never found bodies, just occasionally some personal effects scattered in the desert. Nobody wanted to ask too many questions." The sisters' reputation grew to near mythical proportions. They were simultaneously feared and, in some quarters, quietly admired for their fierce independence in an era when women had few rights and little protection under the law. The Blackwood Ranch became known as a place to avoid, particularly after dark. Stagecoach routes were altered to give the property a wide berth. Even law enforcement approached with caution, if at all. The sisters were not completely without allies. Records indicate they maintained cordial relations with the local Apache, who were otherwise hostile to white settlers. A trading post ledger from 1897 records an unusual transaction in which Eleanor Blackwood exchanged cattle for medicinal herbs with an Apache medicine woman. This connection fueled rumors that the sisters had learned secret Apache methods of tracking and disposal, though such claims are impossible to verify. The most significant documented encounter with the Blackwood sisters occurred in March of 1901, when a group of 5 armed men attempted to force the sisters off their land. According to court testimony given by the sole survivor, Frank Miller, they had been hired by a mining interest that believed there was copper on the Blackwood property. Miller's account, preserved in the territorial court records, described a horrifying ambush. "We approached the ranch house just after sunset, thinking to catch them unawares. The place looked deserted. No smoke from the chimney, no lamps lit. Carter and Wilson went to check the barn, while the rest of us approached the house. That's when the shooting started. Never saw where it came from. Seemed like bullets were coming from every direction at once. I took one in the shoulder and dropped behind a water trough. The others weren't so lucky. I crawled away in the confusion and managed to get to my horse. As I rode off, I swear I saw them, 3 figures on horseback, just watching me go. Could have shot me dead if they'd wanted to. No charges were ever filed against the sisters. The court ruled the men had been trespassing with criminal intent, and the sisters had acted in self-defense. This legal precedent seemed to further cement their untouchable status. Following this incident, there are no further records of direct confrontations at the ranch. The ultimate fate of the Blackwood sisters contains perhaps the strangest twist in this already unusual tale. County records indicate that in October of 1904, the entire property was sold to a corporation listed as Western Mining Consolidated, with papers signed by Eleanor Blackwood as the sole surviving sister. No death certificates exist for Victoria or Catherine, and no explanation was provided for their absence. The sale document preserved in county records included an unusual covenant specifying that the ranch house was to be demolished and the land was not to be inhabited for a period of 50 years. This bizarre stipulation was apparently honored. Aerial photographs from a 1956 geological survey show the property remained undeveloped despite the surrounding land having been divided into smaller ranches and mining operations. What became of Eleanor Blackwood after the sale remains unknown. No further records of her exist in Arizona Territory or, after 1912, Arizona State. There is no death certificate, no record of property purchases elsewhere, no marriage license, no census entry. She simply vanished from the historical record as completely as the unfortunate trespassers had vanished from her land. The story might have remained merely an obscure frontier legend had it not been for the discovery made by Thomas Reeves in 1962. According to his field notes, the metal box he unearthed contained not only Eleanor's journal, but several other items: a tarnished silver locket containing a family photograph, 3 identical silver rings, each inscribed with a different initial, E, V, and C, and most disturbingly, a collection of personal effects, including watches, rings, and wallet contents that appeared to belong to at least a dozen different individuals. Reeves reportedly became obsessed with reconstructing the sisters' story, dedicating his graduate research to the investigation. His thesis advisor, Dr. Robert Chambers, later recalled that Reeves became increasingly paranoid during his research, claiming to have been followed and to have received threatening notes. In December of 1962, Reeves abruptly abandoned his studies and left Arizona. His current whereabouts, if he is indeed still alive, are unknown. The most intriguing document attributed to the Blackwood case emerged in 1968 when an elderly woman named Sarah Jenkins approached the Arizona Historical Society with what she claimed was a letter written by Eleanor Blackwood. Jenkins stated that her father had been the lawyer Philip Green's clerk and had preserved the letter against his employer's instructions. The letter, dated October 15, 1904, the day after the ranch sale was finalized, reads in part, Mr. Green, our business is now concluded, and I shall not trouble you again. My sisters and I appreciate your discretion over these many years. You alone knew our methods and respected our reasons. The necessity of our actions may be incomprehensible to most, but you understood that in this lawless land, justice must sometimes be fashioned by those who have been denied its protection. We did not choose this path. It was forced upon us that October night when they came for father and thought 3 young women would be easy prey thereafter. They were the first to feed the coyotes, but not the last. Each who came with similar intent met similar justice. Victoria passed last winter from the consumption. Catherine followed in the spring. I alone remain to conclude our affairs. By the time you receive this, I will be far from this place, though its memories are carried with me. It is best that the truth of what happened here remain buried in the desert. The coyotes keep their secrets well. The authenticity of this letter has never been definitively established. It was reportedly transferred to university archives along with Sarah Jenkins's sworn statement, but like the items discovered by Thomas Reeves, it cannot currently be located. The land that once comprised the Blackwood Ranch was eventually developed in the late 1960s after the expiration of the covenant. Today, it is divided among several private owners, primarily small cattle operations and vacation properties. Local residents still tell variations of the sisters' story, though it has undoubtedly grown in the telling. Some claim to hear the sound of horses riding past on moonless nights. Others insist the coyotes in the area are unusually aggressive and have been known to unearth items from the past, buttons, buckles, occasionally what might be fragments of bone. Historians remain divided on how much of the Blackwood legend can be verified. The documentation is fragmentary, much of it hearsay or folklore rather than official record. What can be established with certainty is that 3 women did indeed operate a successful ranch in one of the most dangerous regions of the frontier era, that they fiercely defended their independence, and that their methods of doing so left an indelible mark on local history. Perhaps the most telling commentary on the Blackwood sisters comes from a notation made by folklorist Margaret Wilson after interviewing elderly residents of Cochise County. She wrote, "The consistent theme, in all accounts, is not fear of the supernatural or even fear of violence, but rather a profound unease at the inversion of expected order. 3 women who refused to be victims, who instead became something else entirely, judges, executioners, and ultimately ghosts in their own story." The true horror of the Blackwood sisters lies not in their alleged actions, but in the circumstances that transform them from ordinary women into frontier legends. The desert holds many secrets. Some are gradually revealed by the shifting of the sands, while others remain buried forever. In the case of the Blackwood sisters, perhaps some mysteries are better left undisturbed. The coyotes still roam the canyons near the old ranch site. On quiet nights, their howls carry across the valley, a sound that locals say is not quite mournful, not quite hungry, but something in between. A remembrance, perhaps, of the midnight riders who once fed them well. In 1965, a family purchasing a portion of the former Blackwood property reportedly unearthed a stone marker behind what had once been the ranch house site. Crudely carved into it were the words, "We rode at midnight. We protected what was ours. Judge us if you dare." The marker was allegedly reburied at the request of the property's elderly caretaker, who warned that some things are meant to stay buried, like the sisters' justice. Whether this marker truly existed or is simply another layer of the growing legend remains, like so much else in this case, tantalizingly unverified. According to local historians, the origins of the Blackwood family in Arizona Territory have their own mysteries. Jonathan Blackwood appears in regional records rather suddenly in 1872, purchasing land with gold coin rather than banknotes or credit. This unusual transaction prompted speculation that he may have had a complicated past. Some accounts suggest he had been a Confederate officer who fled Reconstruction in Texas, while others propose he had been involved in mining ventures in Colorado before seeking the isolation of the Arizona frontier. What is known with more certainty is that Jonathan Blackwood was widowed long before arriving in Arizona. Mary Blackwood, according to a baptismal record, located in a small church outside of St. Louis, had given birth to all 3 daughters in relatively quick succession before her untimely death. Jonathan apparently raised his daughters alone from an early age, which may explain their unusual upbringing and fierce independence. The Blackwood property was situated in a geographic location that contributed significantly to its isolation and defensibility. Nestled in a small valley with access limited to a single narrow pass between rocky outcroppings, the ranch had natural features that made it easily defensible. Local Apache referred to the area as Shadow Valley in their language, a name that would later seem prophetic given the dark legends that emerged from the place. A survey map from 1880, preserved in territorial records, shows that the original ranch house was positioned on a small rise that provided clear sight lines in all directions for at least half a mile. This strategic positioning suggests Jonathan Blackwood was concerned about security from the beginning. Later additions to the property made after his death included stone watchtowers at the valley entrance and exit, structures more commonly associated with military installations than cattle ranches. The sisters' relationship with the local Apache deserves further examination. At a time when conflict between settlers and indigenous peoples was common, the Blackwood women established an unusual alliance. According to Trading Post records and accounts from nearby settlers, Eleanor spoke passable Apache, a skill almost unheard of among white women of the era. Victoria was said to have studied traditional healing methods, while Catherine reportedly learned tracking from Apache scouts. This cross-cultural exchange benefited both parties. The sisters gained knowledge that enhanced their survival skills, while the Apache received fair trades of cattle and manufactured goods at a time when they were being systematically marginalized. More importantly, the Blackwood Ranch became known as neutral territory, a place where neither Apache raiders nor cavalry patrols were welcome. This arrangement contributed significantly to the sisters' mystique and may explain why their property remained uniquely secure in an otherwise volatile region. The economic success of the Blackwood operation is another aspect of the story that challenges conventional narratives of the era. Financial records preserved in Philip Green's files indicate that by 1895, the sisters' cattle operation was generating annual profits equivalent to approximately $30,000 in modern currency, a substantial sum for the time, particularly for women operating without male oversight. This prosperity did not go unnoticed. Tax assessments from 1897 show an unusual increase in the property's valuation, prompting Eleanor Blackwood to file a formal protest with the territorial governor. Her letter, preserved in government archives, demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of property law and tax codes. The assessment was eventually reduced after Green presented evidence at a hearing in Tucson. The sisters' financial acumen extended beyond ranching. Investment records show they purchased shares in several mining operations, a bank in Bisbee, and most surprisingly, a newspaper in Tombstone. This last investment may explain the curious lack of negative coverage in the local press, despite the sisters' growing reputation for ruthlessness. The paper in question, the Western Sentinel, was a minor publication that operated for only 3 years, but was known for its sympathetic coverage of women's issues and criticism of corrupt mining interests. The most concrete evidence of the sisters' vigilante activities comes from an unexpected source, the personal journal of Sheriff William Kirkland, who served Cochise County from 1894 to 1899. In entries not included in official reports, Kirkland wrote with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect about the Blackwood women. One entry from August 1895 reads, "Another disappearance near the Blackwood place, third this year by my count. Cannot prove anything as usual. No witnesses, no bodies. Asked Green about it, who merely smiled and suggested that perhaps criminal elements were learning to avoid certain properties. These women have created their own kingdom out there, with laws known only to themselves. Cannot decide if they are a menace or merely doing what the law fails to accomplish in these remote areas. Either way, they remain beyond my reach without evidence." This entry suggests that local law enforcement was aware of the sisters' activities, but chose not to pursue the matter, either due to lack of evidence or perhaps a tacit acknowledgement that frontier justice sometimes operated outside official channels. This attitude was not uncommon in the territories, where formal law enforcement was often stretched thin and ineffective. The reputation of the Blackwood sisters spread beyond local boundaries. A Denver newspaper from 1897 contained a brief article titled "Arizona's Lady Vigilantes," describing 3 unmarried women who have established an impenetrable domain where lawlessness is met with swift and permanent disappearance. The article was largely sensationalistic, but indicates that the sisters' reputation had spread across state lines. Similarly, a dime novel published in Chicago in 1899 titled "The Midnight Riders of Shadow Valley" featured thinly disguised versions of the Blackwood sisters as its protagonists. While highly fictionalized, featuring impossible feats of marksmanship and riding, the novel captured the public fascination with women who defied conventional roles and established their own brand of justice. The sisters' isolation was not merely physical, but extended to their social existence as well. Church records from the period show no membership or attendance for any of the Blackwood women. Census takers in 1890 and 1900 noted that the sisters refused direct interviews, providing only basic information through written correspondence. No photographs of the women are known to exist in public archives, though the locket discovered by Thomas Reeves reportedly contained a family portrait taken when the sisters were still children. This deliberate withdrawal from community life fueled speculation and rumor. One persistent story, recorded by folklorist Margaret Wilson, claimed that the sisters had taken a blood oath after their father's death, swearing to claim the lives of any man who threatened their land or liberty. Another tale suggested they practiced strange rituals on moonless nights, though such accounts veered into supernatural territory unsupported by credible evidence. What seems more likely is that the sisters recognized that their unusual independence made them vulnerable, and they cultivated a fearsome reputation as a form of protection. In a letter to their lawyer dated 1896, Eleanor wrote, "We find that reputation serves as effectively as fences in deterring most unwanted visitors. Let them believe what they will if it keeps them at a distance." The decline of the Blackwood saga began with illness rather than violence. Medical records from a doctor in Bisbee indicate that Victoria Blackwood consulted him regarding respiratory symptoms in early 1902. The diagnosis was tuberculosis, at that time often called consumption, and essentially a death sentence in the pre-antibiotic era. Victoria reportedly refused hospitalization, returning to the ranch to be cared for by her sisters. According to a letter from Eleanor to Philip Green dated December 1902, Victoria's condition had deteriorated significantly, leaving her bedridden. The letter requested that Green arrange for monthly deliveries of medicinal supplies and included a substantial payment to ensure discretion. The timing of this illness coincides with a noticeable decrease in reported incidents around the Blackwood property, suggesting the sisters' attention had turned inward. Catherine's fate is less documented. No medical records exist regarding her condition, but local rumor suggested she had never fully recovered from an injury sustained during the 1901 confrontation with the mining company men. The court records of that incident mention that one of the sisters, not specified by name, had been grazed by a bullet during the exchange of gunfire. If this was indeed Catherine, complications from this wound may have contributed to her decline. By early 1904, according to tax records, the Blackwood cattle herd had been reduced to less than half its previous size. Land management had clearly become a challenge for the remaining sister or sisters. This reduction in operations coincides with the period when, according to Eleanor's letter, both Victoria and Catherine had passed away. The sale of the property in October 1904 marked the end of the Blackwood presence in Arizona. The unusual covenant requiring the land to remain uninhabited for 50 years has been the subject of much speculation. Some historians suggest it was simply Eleanor's way of ensuring no one would disturb her sister's final resting places, presumed to be somewhere on the property. Others see it as a more calculating move to prevent any future discoveries that might reveal the full extent of the sisters' activities. Western Mining Consolidated, the company that purchased the land, has its own mysterious aspects. Corporate records show it was formed just 3 months before the purchase, with capital provided by anonymous investors. The company conducted minimal exploratory mining on the property before abandoning operations in 1906. The land then sat untouched for the duration of the covenant, maintained by a caretaker who visited only occasionally. The disappearance of Eleanor Blackwood after the sale has fueled countless theories. A woman matching her description reportedly booked passage on a steamship to San Francisco in November 1904, traveling under the name Eleanor Black. From there, the trail grows cold. Some accounts place her in Europe, others in South America. A particularly persistent legend claims she eventually returned to Arizona under a different identity and lived out her days in Tucson, watching from a distance as her former property sat empty and her legend grew. The discovery made by Thomas Reeves in 1962 briefly threatened to bring the Blackwood story back into the public eye. His academic advisors reportedly warned him that pursuing such a controversial topic might damage his scientific career. Nevertheless, Reeves apparently became obsessed with reconstructing the sisters' story, traveling throughout Arizona and neighboring states to collect accounts from elderly residents who might have had first-hand knowledge of the Blackwood women. According to Dr. Robert Chambers, Reeves' thesis advisor, the young researcher became increasingly paranoid during the course of his investigation. In an interview given to a local historian in 1975, Chambers recalled he would come to meetings looking over his shoulder, claiming he was being followed. He became convinced that there were still people alive who didn't want the full Blackwood story told. I tried to tell him it was all ancient history, but he wouldn't listen. Then one day he just didn't show up for our meeting. His apartment was cleared out, his research gone. Got a postcard from him weeks later from somewhere in Mexico saying only that he was following a promising lead and would be in touch. Never heard from him again. The disappearance of Reeves' research materials from university archives remains unexplained. According to library records, the items were properly cataloged and placed in storage in 1963. A notation from 1968 indicates they were temporarily removed for an exhibition on Arizona history, but there is no record of their return. Subsequent searches have failed to locate them. The letter allegedly written by Eleanor Blackwood and delivered to the Arizona Historical Society by Sarah Jenkins in 1968 provides the most direct insight into the sisters' motivations, if authentic. The reference to that October night when they came for Father strongly suggests that Jonathan Blackwood's death was not accidental, as officially recorded, but rather the result of violence that the sisters later avenged. This would explain the transformation of three relatively unremarkable young women into the fearsome figures of local legend. Their father's murder, likely at the hands of those who coveted his land, would have left them vulnerable in a society that offered little protection to women, particularly those without male relatives. Rather than becoming victims, they chose to become predators. The letters mention that Philip Green alone knew our methods and respected our reasons, implies that the sisters' lawyer was more than just a business representative. He was a confidant and possibly an accomplice. Green's own records show that he purchased unusual quantities of quicklime from a supplier in Tucson between 1893 and 1902, a substance commonly used in that era to accelerate decomposition and mask odors associated with burials. Local ecology may have played a role in the effectiveness of the sisters' disposal methods. The coyote population in the Dragoon Mountains region was particularly dense during that period, according to wildlife surveys conducted by the territorial government. These opportunistic predators would have quickly scattered any remains left in remote areas, making discovery of evidence nearly impossible in the days before forensic science. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 1970s, after the covenant expired, did uncover several anomalies on the former Blackwood property. Ground-penetrating radar identified what appeared to be multiple small pits in a remote canyon, though excavation permits were denied by the new owners. A university research team also noted unusual concentrations of calcium and phosphorus in soil samples from certain areas, consistent with the long-term decomposition of organic material. The psychological impact of the Blackwood legend on local communities persisted long after the sisters themselves had vanished. Throughout the early 20th century, parents in southeastern Arizona reportedly warned children to be good, or the Blackwood women will feed you to the coyotes. Property values around the former ranch remained depressed well into the 1970s, with local residents reluctant to live too close to what many still considered tainted ground. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Blackwood sisters is their status as ambiguous figures, neither purely victims nor wholly villains. In an era when women had few legal rights and little recourse against violence, they created their own system of protection and retribution. Their methods may have been brutal, but many frontier historians note that they operated within the context of a brutal time and place where official justice was often absent or corrupt. Feminist scholars have occasionally cited the Blackwood case as an extreme example of women's resistance to patriarchal violence, though most are quick to acknowledge the ethical complications of vigilante justice. Historical novelist Laura Prentice, who researched the sisters extensively for an ultimately unpublished book in the 1980s, summarized this ambiguity. They were neither monsters nor martyrs, but women who refused to accept the limited options their era offered them. They chose to control their fate through means both terrible and, in their context, understandable. In 1994, a small collection of bones was discovered during construction work near one of the canyons on the former Blackwood property. Forensic analysis indicated they were human remains dating to approximately 1890–1900, but there was insufficient material for identification. The bones showed signs of both gunshot trauma and animal scavenging, consistent with the legends surrounding the sisters' disposal methods. The case was briefly reopened, but closed due to the impossibility of determining identity or circumstances after so many years. Today, the story of the Blackwood sisters exists in a liminal space between documented history and folklore. Tours of haunted Cochise County include the former ranch site, though the original structures are long gone. Local museums display copies of the few verified documents relating to the sisters, alongside more sensationalistic newspaper accounts and artwork depicting 3 riders on black horses. What remains undisputed is that 3 young women, left vulnerable by their father's death in a lawless era, not only survived, but thrived in circumstances that would have defeated most of their contemporaries. Whether through legitimate means or through the midnight justice suggested by legend, the Blackwood sisters carved out their own place in a hostile world, leaving behind a legacy that continues to unsettle and fascinate. The sound of hooves on hard-packed desert soil, the silhouette of riders against the moon, the patient waiting of coyotes at the edge of firelight. These images have become part of the cultural fabric of this corner of Arizona, a reminder of a time when justice was personal, brutal, and sometimes delivered by those from whom society expected only submission. The Blackwood sisters may have disappeared from the historical record, but their legacy persists in the caution with which locals still regard certain remote areas, in the stories told around campfires, and in the subtle ways their legend has shaped the regional understanding of frontier justice. They remind us that the line between victim and vigilante can be crossed in the darkness, that the most dangerous predators are sometimes those who have learned from being prey. In the end, perhaps it is fitting that the full truth remains elusive. The desert keeps its secrets, the coyotes their silence. The sisters who rode at midnight have passed into legend, their story preserved not in official histories, but in whispered warnings and the instinctive unease that still falls over travelers who find themselves on lonely roads near the Dragoon Mountains after dark. And somewhere, perhaps, Eleanor Blackwood's journal still exists, waiting to be rediscovered and to reveal the sisters' story in their own words. Until then, we are left with fragments and echoes, a history written in the spaces between known facts, in the unexplained disappearances of those who threatened 3 women who refused to disappear themselves. The wind still carries secrets across the deserts of southeastern Arizona. Some say that if you listen carefully on certain nights, you can hear the distant rhythm of hooves, and beneath that sound, the patient panting of waiting coyotes. But perhaps that is merely the desert playing tricks, as it has done since long before the Blackwood sisters made their stand, and long after their passing into shadow and legend. What remains indisputable is that in a time and place where women were expected to be vulnerable, the Blackwood sisters created their own form of justice. Whether we view them as victims turned vigilantes or as cold-blooded killers, their story challenges our understanding of frontier morality and the lengths to which people will go to protect what is theirs. As a final note, it is worth mentioning that in 1967, during the construction of a highway some 20 miles from the former Blackwood property, workers uncovered a series of unusual depressions in the soil that local Apache guides identified as old coyote dens. Among the usual debris, They reportedly found weathered personal effects, belt buckles, boot heels, a pocket watch, and what appeared to be human bone fragments. The discovery was noted in county records, but never formally investigated, the remains being attributed to unknown pioneers, fate undetermined. The desert keeps its secrets. The Coyotes remember, and the legend of the three sisters who rode at midnight continues to whisper across the valleys and canyons of Cochise County. A reminder that justice wears many faces, and some of them ride out only when the sun has set and the coyotes begin to call. In recent years, historians have attempted to place the Blackwood sisters within the broader context of women's experiences in the American West. Their story, while extreme, represents just one expression of the complex negotiations women made in a society that offered them few formal protections or opportunities. For every Blackwood-like tale of violent resistance, there were countless women who found more subtle ways to navigate the constraints of their era. A land deed discovered in the Pima County Archives in 1972 suggests that Eleanor Blackwood may have purchased property near Tucson under the name Eleanor Stone in December 1904, shortly after selling the ranch. The timing and the similarity of the signatures have led some researchers to conclude that she did indeed remain in Arizona, albeit with a new identity. The property in question was sold again in 1919, with no record of what became of its owner. If Eleanor did live out her days in relative anonymity in Tucson, she would have witnessed profound changes in the society that had once forced her and her sisters to such extreme measures. Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, bringing more formalized legal structures. Women gained the right to vote in state elections that same year, 8 years before the 19th Amendment granted suffrage nationally. The frontier was rapidly disappearing, replaced by a more ordered society that, while still deeply unequal, offered women avenues of recourse beyond vigilante justice. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of the Blackwood story is how their initial transformation from victims to vigilantes may have trapped them in a cycle they couldn't escape. The letter attributed to Eleanor suggests a weariness with their chosen path, an acknowledgement that their methods, while born of necessity, had exacted a heavy toll. The covenant requiring their land to remain uninhabited hints at a desire to bury not just physical evidence, but also the psychological weight of their actions. Archaeological work done in the area during the 1980s yielded a curious finding that adds another layer to the mystery. In a small cave approximately 3 miles from the former ranch house site, researchers discovered what appeared to be a crude shrine, 3 stones arranged in a triangle, with oxidized metal objects, possibly jewelry, buried beneath each. Carbon dating of charcoal found at the site suggested it had been created sometime between 1902 and 1905, roughly corresponding to the period when the sisters were reportedly dying or leaving the area. Some have interpreted this as evidence that Eleanor created a memorial to her sisters before departing, though this remains speculative. The environmental context of the Blackwood legend deserves consideration as well. The sisters operated during a period of significant ecological transformation in southeastern Arizona. Overgrazing, timber harvesting, and mining were rapidly altering landscapes that had remained relatively stable for centuries. The coyote population was expanding during this period, adapting to human-altered environments more successfully than wolves or other large predators. In choosing these animals as their unwitting accomplices, the Blackwood women aligned themselves with a species known for its adaptability and persistence, qualities they themselves embodied. Water rights, always a contentious issue in the arid Southwest, may have played a role in the conflicts surrounding the Blackwood Ranch. County records indicate that their property included access to one of the few year-round springs in the area, making it particularly valuable. Several of the documented confrontations involved disputes over water access, though these were typically framed as boundary or cattle issues in official reports. The Blackwood women's connection with the Apache people has often been romanticized in retellings of their story. Historical evidence suggests a more pragmatic arrangement. The Apache were themselves being systematically displaced during this period, with the last free bands confined to reservations by 1886. The sisters likely recognized fellow outsiders in these marginalized people and formed alliances based on mutual benefit rather than ideology. Trading post records show exchanges of practical goods, ammunition, tools, and medicine from the Blackwoods, herbs, crafts, and information from the Apache. One aspect of the sisters' reputation that appears consistently in oral histories is their almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings. Travelers reported feeling watched long before reaching the ranch boundaries. Would-be rustlers described aborted attempts after sensing they were being tracked. This heightened vigilance was likely a combination of practical measures, strategically placed lookout points, tripwires, and possibly trained dogs, and psychological warfare. The sisters understood that being perceived as omniscient was as effective a deterrent as actual surveillance. The Blackwood women's business acumen has been largely overshadowed by the more sensational aspects of their legend. Yet financial records indicate they were remarkably successful entrepreneurs at a time when women were largely excluded from economic power. They diversified beyond cattle into mining investments, real estate, and even small-scale banking through private loans. By 1900, their combined assets would have made them wealthy by contemporary standards, particularly for unmarried women in a frontier region. This financial independence was perhaps their most radical act in the context of their era. By securing economic autonomy, they freed themselves from the system of dependence that confined most women to marriage or family support. Their violence, while more dramatic, was ultimately in service of preserving this independence. They killed, if the legends are to be believed, not for pleasure or profit, but to maintain control over their lives and property in a society that offered them few legitimate avenues to do so. The psychological toll of their lifestyle can only be imagined. Isolated by choice and circumstance, carrying the weight of their secrets, the sisters created a world defined by constant vigilance and the capacity for violence. Victoria's tuberculosis and Catherine's alleged injury may have been the immediate causes of their deaths, but one wonders if the strain of their existence contributed to their relatively early demises. Eleanor, the survivor, chose to walk away from everything they had built rather than continue alone, suggesting the burden had become too great. The covenant preventing occupation of their land for 50 years has been interpreted various ways. The most pragmatic explanation is that Eleanor feared future development might uncover evidence of their activities. Others see it as a form of memorial to her sisters, or perhaps an acknowledgement that the land itself had been tainted by what occurred there. The specific time frame, 50 years, would have ensured that virtually everyone with first-hand knowledge of the sisters would be dead before new inhabitants could disturb the property. The development of the land after the covenant expired in 1954 proceeded cautiously. The first purchasers, a ranching family named Hernandez, reportedly experienced numerous equipment failures and livestock losses during their initial years of operation. These setbacks were attributed to practical challenges of rehabilitating long-abandoned land, but local rumors suggested the sisters' influence lingered. By the 1970s, the property had been subdivided and much of the original landscape altered by modern ranching techniques and vacation home construction. Today, visitors to the area would find little evidence of the Blackwood saga. No historical markers identify the site of their ranch house or commemorate their story. The landscape has changed significantly. Groundwater pumping has dried up many natural springs. Invasive grasses have replaced native vegetation, and paved roads cut through what was once remote backcountry. Yet something of the sisters' presence persists in local memory, in the names of geographic features, Blackwood Canyon, Sisters Ridge, and in the stories still told around campfires. In 2010, A small collection of papers was donated to the Arizona Historical Society by the descendants of Philip Green. Among them was a property inventory dated 1904, presumably prepared in advance of the ranch sale. The document lists the expected items, furniture, tools, livestock, but also includes a curious entry: personal armaments, 3 identical Winchester rifles, model 1873, with custom modifications to reduce weight and improve balance for use on horseback. This detail aligns with oral histories describing the sisters as exceptional markswomen, capable of accuracy even while mounted, a skill that would have been essential for their midnight rides. The last verified document concerning any of the Blackwood women is a bank record from Tucson, dated 1925, showing the closure of an account held by E. Stone. The account had been inactive for several years, and the funds, a substantial sum for the time, were transferred to the University of Arizona's Women's Scholarship Fund at the account holder's prior instruction. If this was indeed Eleanor Blackwood's final act, it suggests a desire to provide future generations of women with opportunities beyond those available to her and her sisters. The Blackwood sisters' legacy is complex and contradictory. They were both victims and perpetrators, products of their time, yet defiers of its conventions. Their story has been alternately suppressed and sensationalized, used as a cautionary tale, or celebrated as a feminist narrative of resistance. The truth likely lies somewhere in between these extremes. 3 women who, faced with vulnerability in a hostile world, chose to become predators rather than prey, and in doing so created a legend that continues to resonate through the canyons of southeastern Arizona. As we conclude this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in the history of the American frontier, we are left with more questions than answers. Did the sisters truly feed their enemies to the coyotes under the cover of darkness? How many men met their end at the hands of these 3 women? What finally became of Eleanor Blackwood, the last surviving sister? The desert keeps these secrets, buried beneath layers of time and sand. Perhaps that is as it should be. The Blackwood women created their legend in part as protection, a shield of fear to keep threats at bay. Even now, more than a century later, something of that power lingers. Their story reminds us that history's margins often contain its most revealing truths, that official records tell only part of any story, and that sometimes, in the silence of a desert night, justice wears unexpected faces. The coyotes still howl in the canyons of Coyotes County. The wind still carries whispers across the desert. And somewhere, in the collective memory of the land itself, 3 riders still move like shadows along the ridgelines, guardians of a harsh justice born of harsher necessity. They are the sisters who rode at midnight, who fed their enemies to the coyotes, who created their own laws when societies failed them. Their hoofbeats have faded into legend, but their story endures, a dark mirror reflecting the true cost of survival on America's last frontier.